Hello everyone and welcome to Beyond COVID, the new podcast from Compassion in Politics, where we try to take a step back from the horror and heartbreak of the current crisis to ask, what are we learning from it about how we all live? Can we build back better after the crisis? And what opportunities does it provide to do things differently? My name is Jennifer Nadel and my co-host is
Matt Hawkins, and today we are very excited that Professor Anthony Grayling has joined us on the show. Anthony is Master of New College of Humanities in London and also Fellow of St Anne's College, Oxford, the World Economic Forum and the Royal Society of Arts. He's the author of over 30 books on philosophy, including The Future of Moral Values and What is Good, and the upcoming book, The Good State, which is about the hacking of democracy. Anthony, how are you coping in the lockdown?
I feel very sad indeed for all those people who are suffering the illness, and even more so for those people who've lost people they care about and love. It's very tragic. But personally, I'm okay. I live alone. I have comfortable accommodation and a huge amount of work to get on with. So from that point of view, I'm all right. I hope the same is true of you guys.
Thank you. Yes, we are both doing well, obviously in our respective homes rather than in our office. Now, Anthony, what do you think philosophy teaches us about this crisis and in particular about what we value?
Philosophy challenges us with the demand to think about what we value most, both in our own individual lives and in the world at large. It always asks us to look at the assumptions that we make, look at the things that we do without thinking very much about them, look at the way we value things just because everybody else does and it's in the air, so to speak. And in a situation like this, we have a bit of time to reflect. We may even have it forced upon us to reflect a little bit about whether what we've chosen for ourselves and what we think matters in life really are right. So it's an opportunity to think again. And there's a particular tradition in philosophy, the Stoic tradition. And I know that the very concept of Stoicism, that does seem to be a bit grin and bear it, but that's not actually what the Stoics said. Their view was that if we are prepared to face with courage those things that we have no control over, like earthquakes and tsunamis and growing old and so on, and if we deal with those things that we can deal with ourselves, that is our own fears and desires, our own appetites and wishes, so that we can exercise some self-mastery, then the combination of those things, of courage to the outer and self-mastery to the inner, will help us to live with what they described as nobility. But I think in our present lives now, we just might say to live a life which has, a certain degree of worthiness about it.
You write about this giving us a moment to pause and reflect on what matters most to us. What changes do you think might come about as a result of this hiatus?
Well, it's going to be very interesting to see what all the unexpected changes are, because the longer this goes on, the bigger the difference made to our economies and the way that people trade. I mean, just look, as we're speaking at the moment, oil prices are crashing around the world. You can think about the effect that that will have on the environment, fewer people using motor cars and the rest. There are lots of things that we've done up until now that we're learning we don't need to do. So, for example, for a long time now, it's been possible for people to do quite a lot of the work that they do without having to commute in for long periods of time and over many miles and polluting the environment as they do so. And we're learning how to do this now. So this is one very obvious way that working practices are going to change. And I think people are going to find that if they do change those practices, they actually get much more time available to them in their lives, both for their work and for themselves and their families. So that's going to be one, I think, obvious but very significant change, because that will introduce other changes too. It will result in a new disposal of how people shop and what their leisure activities are, where they go and what they do with their own time. So there could be big differences in patterns of movement and place. So that would be one thing. Another thing that will happen is that people will realize that where they focus their resources, the kind of thing that they spend their money on, kinds of things that they spend their time on, they may discover all sorts of new ways of making use of those resources that provide them with greater satisfaction and more insight in life. But I think the economy is going to take an enormous hit here, and rebuilding and reconstructing in ways that people regard as being desirable, and trying to leave aside those things which are not essential, trying to get back on track with things that matter to us. That will also reconfigure the way we do things. And finally, I think we've learned one incredibly important lesson already, and that is that people who have, up until now, been regarded as the least important members of society turn out to be among the most important members of society. Low-paid workers are absolutely essential. And these are people who keep our streets clean, who move our bins, who take our post around, and then very important people in the health and care sectors as well. We've really learned who matters when things are bad.
How likely is it, do you think, that we will switch back to the old way of doing things, or have things changed irrevocably?
Naturally, most people will be as anxious as possible to forget all this, to get back to what they regard as normal as quickly as possible, to pick up the threads of what they were doing before. So if they don't give enough thought to this, if they don't really dig into the difference it's making to our lives, if we don't prepare not to go back to the bad old normal, then we will. This doesn't last very long, and people are very anxious. You see all those folks in the United States who are complaining like mad, even demonstrating against the lockdown necessity. People who are extremely anxious just to go on as they were before. That temptation will be a very big temptation with lots of people. So we have to take this opportunity now, while people are confronting the new ways of being, the new ways of living, the challenges that their family relationships perhaps are posing them. While they're actually confronting those things now, we've got to invite them and ask them to be thinking about it, and to be making plans for the future, and to be conscious of the things that perhaps they should not be wanting to go back to, the things that we don't want to return to normal over. And if we don't take this opportunity now, then there will be a lot of backsliding.
What's your message for those people who are currently feeling isolated or alone, perhaps also feeling a lack of direction because they are locked in at home?
People thinking to themselves, how long is this going to go on? What impact is it going to have on my income? What impact is it going to have on me personally or on the family? When's it all going to end? And if you just allow yourself to get caught up in those anxieties, hoping that next week or 2 weeks' time is going to be okay, or a month's time, or by June, or if you just keep on looking for little signposts of hope where you can escape the current condition, instead of saying, this is life, this moment. It's not on hold. We're not waiting to get back to where we were at the beginning of March or in February. We've got to put some structure in now. We have to make some plans now. We've got to say, if I'm going to be like this for the next 6 months, what can I use this time to do? How could I make every day something which not merely holds me up, but also equips me, it also enriches me? I mean, it is an opportunity. Alas, tragic and difficult times are also times of opportunity for those who aren't worst affected by them. And if people don't take that opportunity, then when they look back on it, they may very well regret it.
What's your view about the way the crisis has been handled, and in particular the culpability of the government and the Prime Minister, given the level of loss of life that there's been?
Yeah, what we have is, in my opinion, and I won't pull any punches on this, but I think criminally negligent way of handling this. To look at the example of New Zealand and of Germany, and to see how these things have been well handled and thoughtfully handled, how much preparedness there was, how quickly action was taken. They are exemplars of how it should be done. It's frankly shocking the way that it's been mishandled in the United Kingdom and in the United States. It's a tragic mishandling because this has caused, quite literally, thousands of unnecessary deaths. There are thousands of families grieving and stricken because right at the very beginning of this, there was so much wishful thinking and blindness and, okay, let's not do anything that will panic anybody. The worst thing that could happen to the economy is for people start panicking and start closing down too early. all those misjudgments that were made, because we've known about this. I mean, we all know that back in 2016, there was a major risk assessment exercise for an epidemic sickness, and we know that nothing was done on the basis of it. Anybody can go on YouTube and look at Professor Chris Whitty giving lectures at the Gresham College on pandemics and epidemics and how to deal with them more than a year ago. All this was known. The facts were available. The measures to be taken are clear. They have been implemented brilliantly well in other places, like the two countries that I've mentioned. And it is quite shocking and upsetting to think of how much pain and distress this has caused, how much grief it's caused, how much damage, just because there wasn't clarity and boldness and swiftness in action. And there's no excuse for it.
And who do you think should be taking responsibility for this, as you say, unnecessary loss of life?
Well, there has to be an inquiry, and the people who are responsible for taking decisions, the people in government at the very, very highest levels, should be expected to resign, frankly. I mean, this was a dereliction of duty, which in any other circumstance, I mean, if it were the time of war, let us think, or some other kind of major emergency where there were insufficient preparations, where years of underfunding had left the emergency services necessary, like for example, it might be the army or the fire service or whoever it might be. But in a time of disaster, if there was negligence, misjudgment, delay, not taking the matter seriously, not putting on a very high priority the interests of the public and its welfare and security, then figuratively speaking, heads must roll. People must resign. There should be an inquiry, and the inquiry should have teeth, because there are going to be so many people in our country who are going to be stricken by this and by the consequences of this, and it's simply not good enough if members of the government are going to try to blame everybody else, the Chinese or the scientists or the this, that, and the other. It's just simply not good enough. It's staring us in the face, the inadequacy of this response.
Do you think, Anthony, that the problems we are experiencing right now go beyond just the individuals in charge of our government to tell us something deeper about the political culture in Britain?
Yes, I do. I think this is symptomatic of a general climate of what I might describe as excessive partisanship in our politics. Our constitutional and political arrangements in this country are such that they are very, very easy to hack. You know, we have the first past the post electoral system, which results in a two-party system, and the two parties vie with one another to capture enough of a minority of the votes in the country to get their hands on the levers of power. And once they do, they are in complete power. Look at the situation that we have at the moment. We had a government elected back in December on 43% of votes cast, or 29% of the electorate, which has an 80-seat majority over all other parties combined. That's a massive majority, which means that the House of Commons is really just a rubber stamping mechanism for the government. They have total power on a minority of the vote, and they are very partisan. They've got a particular agenda that they want to push through. And that agenda, arguably, is not in the interest of everybody in the country. So the first essential is to have a look at the way our political constitutional arrangements are structured. And I think the first essential of that first essential is we really must reform our electoral system. One thing which is notable about New Zealand and Germany is that these are systems that have proportional representation voting systems. They therefore have coalition government. They therefore have a more consensual government, more responsible government, less partisan. There's less politics in government than there is in situations such as we have here with our plurality voting system. And this does us harm. And when the people who get into government are not mature-minded and not responsible, but are very, very partisan, have very much a particular agenda they want to push, it's distorting and it's dangerous. And indeed, the danger to the country is now palpable, because without a sensible, consensual approach to how the country is governed, you get this kind of situation. You get a group of people who, frankly, are not really competent to deal with situations like the one that has arisen.
When we come out of the crisis, given that the emphasis is going to be very much on the economy and the looming world recession, How realistic is it to think that we're going to see electoral reform happening anytime soon?
Well, I think that the debate about electoral reform has now coming into its own. I think people are conscious of the fact that the mess that we've got ourselves into is because for a very, very long time we've relied upon a certain kind of self-restraint in our political situation. Way back in 1862, when John Stuart Mill published his book, Representative Government, he said, everybody has known for a very long time that with a sovereign parliament that has no constitutional restraints on it at all, parliament can do anything it likes. Leslie Stephen, around about the same time, wrote in an article that if the British Parliament decided to outlaw the existence of blue-eyed babies, then all blue-eyed babies would have to be killed, and that would be the law. Nothing can constrain the government from doing it, other than, he said, the fact that our parliamentarians are gentlemen. Well, he said that, in fact, exactly 50 years before the Nazis took power in Germany in 1932. And, the blue-eyed baby analogy there turned out to be, in fact, a very terribly tragic one. Mill said that it is a sense of constitutional morality, that is the phrase he used, that restrains our MPs and our governments from using this unlimited power that they have. So the idea that you've got an all-powerful institution which is captured by one political party, and then you rely on the people in that party being gentlemen and not overusing their power, that is something that we just coasted along with until recently. And I'm afraid to say that this convention, this attitude, this hope that people are going to be self-restrained is simply not good enough. Because if you get people into positions of power who are not competent, or who aren't really gentlemen or gentlewomen in the required sense, who don't feel that government is a service to all the people. Remember, the concept of democracy is by the people, for the people, not just for the people who voted for you, or not just your side of the political argument. But if you get people who are very partisan in their agenda and who don't really care, and I mean, we've seen this is obvious, the way that nurses have been paid and the attitudes towards people under a certain income level. Look at the Home Secretary, Priti Patel, talking about the people we don't want in the country, people who are going to have jobs less than $25,000 a year. That kind of attitude is the attitude that you get from people who are very partisan. So we've got to change our constitutional arrangements. Now, I think we're going to hear a lot of talk about reform as we struggle through economic reconstruction. And people are going to say all this mess has been caused by the fact that we have dysfunctional government, and governments are constituted in a dysfunctional fashion, so there's got to be reform. And in that conversation about reform, people are going to chuck everything in, including the kitchen sink. There's going to be reform the voting system, reform the House of Lords, reform the monarchy, reform this, reform that, reform the other. And that would be a big mistake. The thing that one has to do is to be very, very strategic and focus on the essential. The central thing that has to be done now is to reform our electoral system. Get a system of proportional representation, which doesn't allow a tiny little minorities of people to hold everybody to hostage. But there are better systems that really work and which throw up these sorts of sensible governments that you see at work in places like New Zealand. And I think the time has come for this conversation now, because as we do that economic reconstruction, we're also going to be thinking about how we rectify things in a way which will ensure that this kind of mistake isn't allowed to happen again.
And lastly, Anthony, slight change of focus. What is the thing that you are struggling with most about this lockdown, and what is your go-to comfort for dealing with it?
Well, I'm something of a traveller. I spend a lot of time writing, and I'd like to be able to get to another geographical location, so somewhere fresh and new, perhaps to the seaside or a lakeside somewhere, with the work that I've done, so that I can take some time to read over it and to get some proportion on it. I miss that tremendously now. I yearn to be able to jump onto the Eurostar and get over to France and hear French being spoken around me. I must point out to people, by the way, that I try to do this responsibly, so I have a lot of trees planted every year to try and take some of the carbon I'm generating into the atmosphere by this travel. So far as the comforts, well, I quite enjoy my solitude, and I love my work, and I've got a lot to do. I've got 2 books on the go, so I can jump out of bed every morning and feel that I've got unrestricted time just to get down to that and get on with it. And I take a great deal of satisfaction in that.
Finally, Anthony, if there was one message you'd like to leave our listeners with, what would it be?
I would urge people to make very good use of the time, to do the things that they, in normal life, wish they had the time to do.
A huge thank you, Anthony Grayling, for talking to us about life beyond COVID. And next time, we'll be talking to Dr. Phil Hammond, physician, broadcaster, comedian and private eye columnist. He'll be talking to us about life on the front line of the NHS and how his work as a doctor has helped him develop his political outlook. So I hope you will join us. Beyond COVID is part of the Real Agenda Network, produced by Kitty Horlick and brought to you by Compassion in Politics. We would love to hear from you, so please do get in touch with any comments or feedback. You can find us online at compassioninpolitics.com or on Twitter. And of course, we'd also love you to subscribe and spread the word about the podcast. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, or any of your other favourite podcast providers by searching for Compassion in Politics. Thanks again for joining us, and we look forward to being with you again soon.